Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality. It may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
Hello, everybody. I'm Natasha Helfer. I'm a relational and sex therapist, and this is my podcast where we try to attack shame pretty much any way we can. We're trying to get healthier through education, stories, and relationships. And I'm super excited to have Preston Hobbs with me today for several reasons. One is that he works for me. Woohoo! So excited to highlight the amazing people that are part of my team. So he's a certified mental health counselor working towards his license. So he's an associate right now in both in the states of Wyoming and Utah. Yeah, we're just thrilled to have him at Symmetry Counseling and excited for all the work that he'll do with us. The second reason I'm super excited for this interview is because Preston has decided to talk about, not something that just hits him professionally, but also quite personally. So we'll talk a little bit about why Preston kind of comes into the field, what got him excited about studying psychology and mental health counseling. And a lot of that has to do with his own journey growing up in a high demand religion. Both of us come from the Latter-day Saint, aka also known as Mormon tradition. So he went through what's unfortunately a very common experience, which is that of young men being kind of shamed for normative sexual development, especially things like masturbation, being curious about sexually explicit materials, and was pretty much sent through all the avenues of like 12-step programs, sex addiction programs. And so he's here to talk a lot about how that impacted him, how that impacts his marriage, and how they go forward from kind of, going from this kind of sex negative space to a more sex positive space and the challenges that has been like for him. So anytime anybody's willing to talk about things of this nature, I'm really kind of struck by the courage that takes and, the vulnerability. So I'm hoping that you as the audience can make room for his story and his ideas. So welcome to the show, Preston.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on, Natasha. I know for those listening, I've already said this to Natasha, but it's so surreal for me to be on the podcast, let alone working for Natasha, because about 3 years ago, back in 2021, I first learned of Natasha and her work when she was on the Mormon Stories podcast, talking about the work she does. And it was the first time I've ever heard someone normalize normative sexual behaviors. Mm-hmm. And so it really started getting the gears turning in my brain of like, okay, hold on, maybe how I've been treated and the things that I really have shamed myself for might not be so much of an issue. So it just really kind of put me on a different path forward. So it's really surreal to be here. I'm excited to talk about my story. So let's do it.
Yeah, let's do it. Especially because as you've joined the team, you've been really upfront with me about, how this has challenged you. It's kind of like almost deconstructing work just in joining a sex positive team because you're like, oh my goodness, what would other people think if I was on this side of the table now, right? Or things like that. So we'll definitely talk about those kinds of things. But why don't we get started by just having you share a little bit about your history? Where do you come from, as much as you're comfortable with, your upbringing, and maybe some of the messages that you were starting to receive from an early age in regards to sexuality?
Yeah, holy cow. So I guess before I get into it, and I'm already emotional, because what I'm about to share today is so personal. Like, depths of hell, kind of dark moments, personal. And I know there's so many people out there, that we see professionally now that we're trying to help heal through that, going through it now. And there's people still in those, in those spaces that are really feeling those just dark, stressful, anxiety-ridden feelings. And so my heart is just going out to all those people and also holding space for the people who maybe these, some of these experiences we're going to talk about are working for them. So it's just, I really want to do a good job of holding kind of both spaces right now. But yeah, whether that's people kind of in the addiction model or active believing members. I really wanted to make it a point today to just hold space for both. So anyway, so for me, I grew up in Cache Valley, in Preston, Idaho. It is 20 minutes north of Logan, Utah, 2 hours north of Salt Lake. I come from a very rich pioneer heritage. So my ancestors settled southern Idaho. So I have a very long lineage of Mormonism. And so, yeah, for me, I grew up in a very active household. My parents went to the temple very frequently, held callings. Yeah, my dad was in the bishopric a few times. My mom was a Relief Society president several times. And so, yeah, just my childhood is very much filled with memories of going to church every week, primary, Sunday school. And I did all the things. I did Boy Scouts. I got my Eagle Scout. I went on a mission. I got married in the temple. So I feel like I don't know, this is kind of crazy to talk about. I've never really talked about this kind of chronologically with anyone, but I guess I just kind of had kind of a stereotypical Mormon upbringing, of just that community, going to all the parties. So it was very much part of my life. And so kind of when it comes to holding space, like I really tenderly hold space for some of these experiences that I had that more or less maybe gave me character, and also on the other side of the coin, really caused me to internalize a lot of shame and very low self-worth. So when it comes to sexuality, I know so many people who relate to this, but I have memories as a little boy of maybe watching cartoons and just putting my hands down my pants because it was very soothing, and getting in trouble for that. And then as I grew older and started experiencing more sexual feelings, sexual thoughts, I think pretty quickly I internalized that it wasn't good, that I needed to put that on the back burner until I was married. But the problem arose when I found that I couldn't just stop having sexual thoughts. And so I really started to internalize, especially around puberty age, that just something was wrong with me, that I was a freak or a pervert, not capable of being I don't know, practicing self-control. I really internalized messages that I must be just a very disrespectful person towards women if I can't stop having sexual thoughts or sexual urges. So yeah, and then I don't know how much more you want me to keep going leading up to some of my other experiences.
No, I think this is great. This is exactly the dilemma, right? Is that you, as a small child, start exploring your body. It's very, very normal for toddlers and 5-year-olds and even 6 and 7-year-olds, before they kind of understand privacy, to be rubbing up against things, to have their hands down their pants. And really, for young kids, for the most part, it's soothing. Like you said, it's like sucking your thumb or pulling on your earlobe or having a binky, or having a blanket, that helps soothe, kind of, helps you go to sleep or helps you relax. These are all very normative behaviors for very young children to have. But yes, they are dealing with the anxiety of caretakers that will usually stop that behavior. And in our kind of circles, in our communities where it's more conservative or religious, that can be done in a shameful way. In more sex progressive homes or sex positive homes, they might just be redirected, like, well, go do that in your bedroom, right? Or do that in private, or, so they're not necessarily told to stop doing it, but they're just more taught privacy boundaries. Whereas kids kind of in our backgrounds are just told kind of harshly to stop, and not always with explanations of why. And so it can be pretty confusing to know, why is it bad to do something with your own body? A similar thing that I've kind of had people tell me about is, like, back in the day, being left-handed wasn't always supported. So like, kids being, harshly taught that they couldn't use their left hand for writing or for things like that. So again, something that comes natural to a child, but they're overcorrected in an inappropriate way. And what that does kind of to begin this shame cycle, right? So you did a good job of that. But yeah, I'd love to hear kind of the rest of it as you go through adolescence. And I mean, this is usually when young Mormon men and women are going into bishops' interviews and being asked about their sexuality. I don't know if you were the type of kid who would go in to try to appease your guilt, or if you would try to hide it and then feel guilty about that. There's lots of different ways, young men and women kind of deal with these feelings.
Yeah. My gosh, that's the thing, is there's so much to process, whether it's like how you were met as a child when you started just touching your own body, to what kind of feelings of guilt and to what extent did you feel as an adolescent, and how did you try to release that guilt, and who did you feel safe with, if anybody. And we haven't even broached the subject of maybe sacrament meeting talks or general conference talks. So yeah, I guess kind of going back to my experience as a little boy, like, going back to holding space, like, my parents were just acting within the system they were brought up in. And I'm sure that if they knew better, if they had the information maybe that I do now, that so many people do now, that we're talking about right now, they would have maybe approached 6-year-old me with a little more curiosity and compassion. And so I've done a lot of personal work of feeling very angry, to now I feel like I see just the broader picture of the broader system, that they really heard intense things from, like, Bruce R. McConkie, or just, that's kind of the era they came up in, and that's all they had to really work off of. But yeah, like, I remember, like I said, just watching cartoons and just getting reprimanded. I don't have to go into details of don't do that. That's not for touching. And just feeling really embarrassed and quickly learning, like, okay, like, that's not okay. And then, like, if I would find myself doing it, really feeling like I had to hide it. So I would cover myself with a blanket or a pillow. And so I feel like that's kind of where it started. Just kind of those little pieces of shame that start to creep in, those messages of, like, oh, this is wrong, and if you do this, you're wrong. Then I guess moving forward, my mind goes to, like, junior high. So I feel like I was kind of a late bloomer, both physically and then also just, like, kind of basic understanding of, like, sexual things. Like, I was that kid at the lunch table that would always ask, like, oh, what's a blowjob? Like, what does it mean if someone's horny? Oh man, yeah, my mind is kind of racing here. I could tell early on that there were, like, things that I didn't understand. So, like, one time before a basketball game, I don't know why I did this, but I packed a bottle of lotion because I thought, oh, if I if I get lotion and I, like, massage my legs will be ready to go before the game, and maybe I'll play better and I'll be warmed up. And my teammates, like, found that bottle of lotion, and, like, they were like, oh, we know what Preston's doing before the game, like, masturbating. Like, I had no idea what they were talking about. Like, my mind just wasn't there, because I think, like, in, like, just my early years, I don't know if I was sheltered, but I just I was very pure. Like I think I really turned a lot of stuff off. I remember then moving along when I finally did discover masturbation. I was really scared of like what the hell just happened. Like what the heck is this stuff coming out of my body? Like I had no idea what was going on. And funny enough, like I when I discovered masturbation, I was on a Boy Scout trip of all places. And when I returned home, I remember just, oh man, like active members, I feel like will be familiar with the phrase return with honor. It's usually attached to those who go out on missions and come home. You're told, like, return with honor, give it your all, be obedient, um, come back clean, sort of thing. I remember feeling like so dirty and just, man, just feeling like I couldn't look my parents in the eyes. And
Coming home from this Boy Scout trip, you mean?
yeah, coming back home from this Boy Scout trip, I was gone for like 3 weeks. Just yeah, just feeling like I came back lesser than. Um, and I feel like something that's a really common experience with like um yeah, people, adolescents and high demand religions, maybe when you like first discover sexual things is you start like really bargaining with yourself and bargaining with God. Like, I promise I won't do this again. Please just help me. Like, I promise that's the last time. But that just leads to a very problematic cycle where you just white knuckle, like, please, please, please help me. And then you do it again. And it just repeats itself. And you begin to wonder, like, what is so wrong with me? And I speak for myself. I began to wonder what is so wrong with me that I can't stop masturbating. And why isn't God helping me? Why can't I get over this? And so at this time I was going into my freshman year of high school. Like I said, I feel like I was very late to the scene. um, and I kind of continued on, I feel like this natural progression of like exploratory behaviors. So I started like coming across like pictures, like sexual pictures, and then eventually discovered like pornographic videos. And yeah, so I guess once it got to that point, like for me, my shame and kind of the secrecy and like hiding things really intensified. And I would carry so much guilt. And so a lot of my experience in the church was confessing to bishops. And I know a lot of people talk about that they've had very wonderful bishops, but I feel like didn't, I didn't, I wasn't so lucky all the time. I remember the first time I ever confessed to a bishop, like, met with him. He's like, okay, going through the questions. All right. Do you have any concerns with the law of chastity? And it's funny, I guess, going back really quick. Well, it's not funny. It's really sad. Every time I knew I was going to be talking to the bishop that day, I would go back and forth in my head of like, do I tell? Do I not? Is this a big deal? Is it not? Like, can I keep this in? Nope, I can't handle this guilt. I've got to tell. Okay. So then when the bishops would ask me, like, do you have any concerns about the law of chastity? I remember so clearly the first time I ever did. And I said that, yeah, like I masturbate sometimes. And he told me never listen to what the so-called experts say because it's not natural. And so one boom, like that hurt. like looking back on it, I really internalized like, oh, I'm not natural. Like what I'm doing is disgusting. It's not natural. Like, and then something that's very important within LDS culture is that young men go on missions. And he told me if I continued, I would not be able to go on a mission. So if I kept masturbating, like I wouldn't be able to go. And there's that comes with so many layers of kind of how people view you or interact with you within the community, and really how you feel about yourself if you can't go on a mission, or if you come home early. It's just really sad. There's just so much pressure put on young men within the church. Yeah, so maybe let me stop there. I feel like
Yeah,
I feel
that's a
like that was a
lot.
lot. So I feel like maybe you have something to add, but
No, I mean, I guess I'll go back to how you were talking about your parents and where they came from, and I do think it is important to lay out a little bit of historical context. I mean, here in the United States of America, even people like, I don't know how many people know this, but like Kellogg cornflakes, Kellogg, I don't know what his role was. I don't think he was a physician. I don't know what he was, but he came up with Kellogg's cornflakes and graham crackers so that it would be bland food so people would not masturbate. So, and whatever time frame that is, right? Like, I don't know, Kellogg's alive, like anyway. And so even back then, there were like these myths that masturbation would cause acne, that masturbation would cause insanity. So imagine you're a teenager with acne, which is a very visible thing, and I'm guessing was pretty common, that all of a sudden here's this like, public way that people think that you're masturbating. I mean, just the shame, in this country around sexuality is not unique to Mormonism. It's, but then of course every religious kind of sect kind of comes up with their own ways of managing some of this sexual anxiety that we've had as a public. And then your parents being Mormon, yes, they would have heard things like masturbation leads to homosexuality. They would have, which again, who cares if you're homosexual? But back in that time, that was a big sin, to be homosexual. And so if you're masturbating, or that that if you're masturbating, it's going to lead to more and more stimulation, right? Something like that. So you're going to go down a slippery slope where, to the point of people thinking you're just going to become a pedophile, or, something like that. So you're looking at porn now, right? And so you're going to become criminal in your ways of dealing with sexuality. And so a lot of fear-based messages. And of course, anytime you're dealing with religion, you're not just dealing with these leaders, you're dealing with a God that these leaders represent. So then that's how you're conceptualizing this divine being, right? That has a lot of power, power to see you, power to know whether or not you're doing what's right, power to understand what's going on in your mind. That's usually how people see God. So it's not like you can be private from God.
Yeah.
I think that leads into a lot of like when I'm thinking of you as a 14-year-old young man, or, 13 to 15, somewhere around there, wondering like, do I even tell the bishop about this? And people might be like, yeah, why would you tell the bishop about that? But when you're coming from the construct that God can see everything you're doing, and God knows that you didn't go confess to the bishop when you should have, you can see why talking to the bishop, even though it's problematic in its own right, might help alleviate some of that guilt, at least temporarily, for these kids who are under this worldview.
Yeah, totally. Like, it just created so much anxiety for me and so many people I know who have had similar experiences where ultimately I was confessing to get right with God. And on top of that, also, like, if I chose not to confess, I really felt like then I was affecting so many people around me. So, for example, if I chose to bless the sacrament without telling the bishop that I looked at porn that week, then in my head, it felt like, okay, like all these people who came today, like the meaning that they draw out of the sacrament is now void, and it's all my fault. Or even like there's messages, that if I'm not following certain commandments, obviously right now, one of them being the law of chastity, then I'm not entitled to certain blessings. So therefore, if something bad happens to me that week, or if I have a terrible day at school, like, it's because I masturbated. It's because I looked at porn. Like, so I just felt like every move I was making in high school, just like in that period of time, was just being watched. And like you said, by God. um, so it was just a very stressful time. And um, going back to like what you were saying about just the messages, like even just in society about masturbation um, and just sexual things, it's like kind of going back to my parents. In their minds, I feel like they felt like they were protecting me. Like, don't touch yourself because I want to teach you that, this isn't healthy, because if you do, who knows where it will lead. Like you said, pedophilia or problematic porn use or acne. Or like other things I heard was that if you masturbate too much, like you said, you'll turn gay, which in the context of Mormonism is very scary. But that also like your penis will shrink, like just the fear or like the attached meanings were just coming from all sides. It felt like ultimately leading to me just not feeling safe in my own body or my own thoughts. And I guess as you talked about, just more of some of the messages that, are kind of commonplace for people to internalize within the church is, I think when I was like a junior, senior in high school, I feel like the Mormon messages started kind of taking off. For anyone who doesn't know, they're just, I don't know, 3 to 5 minute videos with like ideally a positive message that the church started putting out. I don't know if you want to call it like marketing, but they were, I know that they were intended to be a positive thing. But a lot of those that came out started to really scare me. I remember they put out one video where it's put to the voice of Jeffrey Holland, who is one of the top leaders within the church. And he's talking about addiction to porn and how problematic it is. And in this video, there's two sides of the screen. And in the video, it's following a man within his family. And on one side of the screen, it's playing what happens to him as he chooses not to look at porn, to spend more time with his family. And in that side of the screen, in that video, like it progresses and it's happy. They're going to the fair, they're laughing, they're playing games. And on the other half of the screen, it's this man, the same man, but he chooses to look at porn. And it ultimately shows in the video, like his family falling apart. And at the same time, he had also put out the talk of like, we're raising the bar. So if you want to go on a mission, like we're expecting more of you. And if you choose to go without confessing these things, like basically you'll pay for it. Like the spirit won't be with you. Just so there were some really like scary things coming out, I feel like at a very vulnerable time for me. And I know I'm talking a lot, so feel free to jump in at any point, but I remember another thing too. So I remember I went to a stake priesthood meeting with my dad when I was like just turned 12. And the stake president got up and his talk was about pornography and how horrible it is. And he started talking about a man that he knew who was in jail, according to him, of course, that was addicted to pornography. And they were able to tell because of certain chemicals in his bloodstream that were a telltale sign that he was watching pornography. And I remember exactly where I was, like well over a decade ago, almost 2 decades ago now, but where I was in this chapel, what the man looked like, what color tie he was wearing, and just how scared I felt. And of course, at this time, I had never found porn. Actually, I take that back. One time I stumbled upon a porn site by mistyping lego.com. And I remember being terrified and shaking. And I went to my mom and it was kind of, no big deal. But in this meeting, I just remember feeling so scared. Like the stakes were so high that if I ever get into whatever this pornography thing is, like I'm going to jail, people will be able to tell, I won't be able to keep it a secret, like, and ultimately that I'm doing like one of the worst things you could ever do. So just a very scary thing. And I also like something that used to cause me a lot of frustration, like when I first started, like, I guess trying to work, like, quote unquote, work on the behavior, was in my Sunday school lessons. Every so often we'd get the law of chastity talk, or the law of chastity lesson, where the leaders basically talk about don't have sex before you're married, don't watch porn, don't masturbate, don't create these feelings in yourself. But something that really frustrated me was, like, early on when I would get those lessons, people would say, don't look at porn. It's really bad. It'll destroy your life. But no one ever told me what porn was. I just heard over and over, don't look at porn. Porn is bad. But in my young, naive brain, I had no idea what it was. And so, kind of coming full circle, like, when I started to discover porn and view porn, and I would feel guilty, like I didn't know how to talk about it, because I wasn't even sure of, like, is this porn? Like, is this okay? And I have memories of, like, desperately wanting to ask my parents for help, but just feeling like so ashamed and so afraid. Like, I didn't want to worry them. I didn't want them to look at me differently. Yeah, I don't even know if I'm coherent right now, making sense. I feel like so many memories are flashing into my mind. Like, it's just such a crap storm, just, oh man.
Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, this is kind of your first time outside of, like, probably your own therapy sessions, right? Where you're just kind of telling some of your story. And so I think that's pretty normal, right? To have all these things come out. And by the way, like, here, like, I totally welcome your emotion. I totally welcome, you're never talking too much. I'm just, really interested in hearing what you have to say. And I think others will be too. So as much as possible, just settle into it, right? Like, you don't need to worry so much about all that. But yeah, I mean, I think, and having you go from story to story and all these different examples, and, even being able to remember the clothing of the man who kind of gave a very impressionable message, right? This is the thing, is that these children we're talking to about these things are impressionable. They're at impressionable ages. As young as 11 years old, you're starting to get these messages that are really kind of more directed towards older men. And yes, it's so interesting. Like, on the one hand, we don't offer hardly any comprehensive sexual education in the church. On the other hand, we're using very big terms: masturbation, pornography, fornication, adultery. I mean,
yeah.
Words are pretty much, you've probably heard all of these words by the time you're 7 years old. Just listen to general conference talks with your parents, And so these are big words, and nobody's really explaining them. Nobody really talks to kids about what sex is usually. And even if, sometimes they don't even get the talk, at puberty or anything. Some parents completely just are so uncomfortable talking about anything sexual that they won't even give the one talk, right? The birds and the bees talk. And even when parents do, it tends to be very short and to the point, and they're not using all these fancy words necessarily, right? And so I do think we cause an interesting conundrum that we're willing to use these very, very provocative, clinical, and even difficult verbiage. But then we won't even talk to kids about, this is your penis and this is your vulva. Don't even really share that hardly. And so it's difficult. And I think that's why we get a lot of people saying, oh yeah, it was my bishop who told me what masturbation was, right? It was my bishop who told me what porn was, which that's also inappropriate, right? To have this religious leader basically offering you sex ed around certain topics, not comprehensive. And parents aren't really doing that. The bishop is. I've heard so many times, especially women saying, it was my bishop who explained and described what masturbation was to me. And that was traumatic in of itself, right? Is to have this older man who's in this ecclesiastical role tell me what masturbation is. So it's very messy. And I think before we head into the next topic, which is I'm going to want to hear a lot from you about what did the church do? Where did they send you? What did you're dealing with us. And I just want to, again, impress upon people, this is a young, teenager. You've had zero sexual experience. You're a virgin.
Yeah.
Your biggest sin is that you've touched your own body and that you've looked at sexually explicit materials, sounds like, for the most part. Uh-huh. And from a very young age, you're starting to feel this worry. And it's again, that causation and correlation, right? Like in statistics, the first thing that we learn in statistics is that people mess up causation and correlation all the time. Like just because there's 7 cats and 3 of them liked this food doesn't mean that all cats, silly things like that, silly examples like that. But when you were describing that in high school, like if you got a bad grade, if you had a bad day, if you had a challenge, maybe if you lost a game, maybe if you, the girl that you asked out said no, like now everything is going through this lens of, oh, I'm a sinful, deviant person. Yeah. And that's why I'm quote unquote not being blessed, instead of seeing all of those things as normal parts of being a teenager, right? Even that, like you're not even being taught like normal emotional education, that everybody has feelings. We're not all supposed to be happy all the time, but everybody struggles. Everybody has low days. So you're not being taught sexual education. You're not being taught emotional education. And so anytime you're dealing with a hiccup, you immediately correlate it to, oh, it's because I touched myself. The other thing I wanted to say really quickly too, just to support your story, is that the reason why this gets so closely tied to the language of addiction in these communities is because what you described is so accurate. Like here's this normal drive that nobody's normalizing. So of course, a normal drive is going to be repetitive, right? I think most people who have sexual drive would say, yeah, I probably get horny once a month or once a week or 5 times a week, or we all have a normal drive. And so of course you're going to have that be cyclical, right? And repetitive. And so then the addiction community kind of co-opts that and says, well, see, it's repetitive. It's addictive. It's cyclical. But that's the difference between having a substance you're dependent on versus a normal drive, like eating, pooping, sleeping, having sex.
Yeah.
Right. Nobody's addicted to pooping, but somehow we have to do it almost every day. I don't know.
Yeah. But keeps happening.
So anyway, I don't know if you have any thoughts about what I shared, but I would like to kind of move forward then into what happens, as far as getting help for these issues that you're describing so well.
Yeah. So, okay. So of course a lot is coming up for me. So buckle up. I wanted to just go back real quick to some earlier things, and then I will come back to what happens next, kind of what the normal process is. But I first feel like I have to give my parents credit, like both my parents and especially my mom. I know they tried really hard. Like my mom would consistently say like, hey, if you have any questions about sex, like you can ask me. Like anything is on the table, you can ask me. And my dad too, like the few times I ever asked him like, what's this? What's that? Like he would do, they would do their best to tell me and explain it. But the problem was like what I was experiencing like at church and seminary and the talks I would listen to was I felt like this was a no-go zone. Like this was my problem. Like I'm the one messing up. I'm the one who keeps choosing. Like that's what I internalized, was that it's a choice. I kept choosing to do this. I'm choosing to let these feelings happen. So I got to figure this out, which is just so sad, because ultimately I feel like what happens is a fabricated problem, like a problem that doesn't need to be a problem is created. And then whether it's addiction treatment programs or confessing your bishop or ultimately like Savior Jesus Christ, like here it is, we've got the solution. Like if you do this, it's bad, but we can help you over here. So really frustrating. But something you said too about like the big words we hear from such a young age, but no one really explains what it all means, like is so true. Like, because I remember from a very young age hearing about like reading in the scriptures or hearing people say like harlots or concubines or fornication or adultery. Like, and so one time in seminary, so I was in high school, I think I was a freshman. We were having a lesson, and wherever we were reading in the Bible had the word fornication. And we kind of glossed over it and went to the next thing. But I raised my hand and said, excuse me, and asked, what does fornication mean? Like, I don't know what that means. Can someone please explain it? Teacher, can you please tell me what this word is? And instantly, he and the whole class like laughed at me. And the seminary teacher said, oh, we know what Preston's thinking about, and just laughed and didn't even answer my question and just went on. And so here I was, like, at the time I was masturbating and viewing porn. And so I thought, like, oh shit, like he sees right through me. Like when I was just asking a genuine, sincere question, like, what is this word? So there were just so many little things like that that just occur here and there. And I know there's people out there who hopefully are hearing this and are thinking, that was me too. Like, it's so embarrassing that we're shamed for a biological process. Like, we're biologically designed to think about sex and to have drives, like regular drives, like you said. So just so frustrating, and so sad. It's so tragic. Anyway, so coming back to your question of what happens next, like, so I have so many experiences that span from being a teenager, getting ready to go on a mission, to coming home from my mission before I ultimately stopped going to church. So in high school, when I would come to my bishop and say, and I just want to paint a picture too, like, oh man, I don't even know if I can articulate what it feels like to confess to a bishop, because you're essentially like, if I can just try to paint a picture, you feel like you're this, like you're in rags and you're all dirtied and beat up and you're coming to like the knees of this authority figure and begging for forgiveness. And for me, like I can connect with that feeling right now of just like wanting to be forgiven so bad. Like, I'm sorry I keep doing this. Like, I don't want to be bad. I want to be good. And anyway, so it's such a vulnerable and scary and emotional process, or at least it was for me. Because in that moment, the bishop holds so much power of ultimately what's your life going to look like for the next few weeks, for the next several years, depending on how severe he decides to, I don't want to say punish, but that's basically what it is your punishment that you got to go through to receive your worthiness back. So I would go to my bishop, tell him that I'd been struggling that week. I've been looking at porn, I've been masturbating. And essentially then what happens is it's like, okay, you're unworthy. You are now unworthy to bless the sacrament. We can't let you take the sacrament. And so what that looks like is normally when I'd go to church, I'd show up a few minutes early. I'd go prepare the sacrament, like break the bread, set up the table, put like the cloth over the sacrament. And but those times when I was going through my what it's normally called is just repentance process, is instead of going to the front of the chapel where everyone can see me, now I'm just sitting with my family and everyone can see me. And so everyone knows, oh man, what did Preston do? Like, normally he's up there, but he's not today. And my family had no idea like what I was going through. But I remember one of the first times I didn't take the sacrament, like normally I would try to like show up late. If I knew I didn't take the sacrament, I'd try to sneak in the back or sit somewhere. If I couldn't manage to show up late, I would sit on the end of the row and have my siblings in between me so that my parents couldn't see. But gosh, I remember the first time, like my dad saw that I didn't take the sacrament, and I could just see like his concern of like, what did you do? Like, what's happening? What's wrong with my son? What's going on? Um, and again, like the whole congregation, so roughly 200 other people can see you, and they know that you've done something. Because like people would come up to me and say, "Hey, can you help bless the sacrament?" And I'd have to say, "No, I can't. Sorry, I was bad." Um, and so normally for me, in the time that timeline of high school, like I wouldn't be able to take the sacrament for about a month. And then kind of the, I guess, protocol was, yeah, if you can go a certain amount of time without doing it, then you can take the sacrament again, and then boom, you're worthy. Um, and for me, I worked so hard to be like exactly honest, exactly obedient, to where I would confess every time. But slowly over time, like it just got too exhausting. And so I wouldn't tell anymore every time I masturbated. I would only tell if I watched porn. And then it got to the point where I was like, okay, I just can't do this anymore. Okay, I'll just tell if I watched too much porn or if I looked at something that felt scary or like I wasn't comfortable with. But the problem with that was that then it just led to more guilt of like, oh, I'm a sinner. I'm trying to hide from God. Um, and so it's funny that earlier you brought up acne. Because fast forward, I was now 19. I was getting ready to go on a mission. And of course, this dang porn problem, this dang masturbation issue had to get worked through. They had to make sure I was worthy. Um, and to do that, I had to meet with a stake president who is higher up in authority, and responsibility than bishops. And when I first met with him, he told me that he expected me to be exactly honest, with everything I was about to be asked. And he opened up his iPad and opened up a note and asked me like detail upon detail upon detail of, have I ever done this? Have I ever looked at this? Have I ever searched this category? Do I look at heterosexual porn or homosexual porn? Like, and he literally made a note in his iPad. And then it was just grueling. It was so embarrassing. And it was things I had already talked to my bishop about, but I had to revisit again. And I remember one time he even told me, like, I can see in your eyes that you're not spiritually confident. And so again, it's like, oh no, like they can all see through me. Like my self-esteem was just never, as a teenager, my self-esteem was never high because it always came back to this, like, as long as I'm doing this, like I can't be confident. I can't hold my head high. Like I'm sinning. So anyway, back to the acne. I was about to leave on my mission in like a week, and my stake president asked me like, how are you doing? And it's weird because he actually hadn't asked me specifically about masturbation, just the other things. But I said, yeah, like I still do it sometimes. And he's like, oh no, like this is terrible. I messed up. I should have been asking about masturbation. Normally the standard is we don't want you to masturbate for 6 months to a year. And he's like, but okay, if you masturbate once this week, you can't go. And anyway, so for me, what that brought up was just stress and anxiety up to that point in my life I have never experienced. And I had like the worst breakout of my life, to the point where people would ask me like, dude, what's going on with your skin? Why are you breaking out so bad? And it was because I was so stressed out that like I was going to mess up, that I wasn't going to be able to control myself. And so something that ended up happening was if I was able to make it that week, what my stake president wanted me to do was to, before I was set apart, which for anyone listening just means that the stake president and some other men would put their hands on my head and give me a blessing, basically symbolizing like, okay, you are now a missionary. This is what you are now. You're good to go. Before I was able to do that, I had to pull my mom aside privately and tell her I'm clean, which I did that. So before I walked into the church, I said, Mom, can I talk to you? And everyone went inside, and it was just me and my mom outside on the sidewalk, sun setting. And I had to say, Mom, I just need to tell you that I am clean. And I felt like the biggest freaking liar, because at never any point in my life had I felt clean. And again, back to that, what I said earlier, it just is such a fabricated problem. Like, I never had to feel all that as a teenager. I could have just been being a teenager. I could have just been having fun, living life, but that was always just in my head at all times, basically. So anyway, I went on a mission.
Let me pause there just for a second,
Okay.
because I know we're going to go into treatment next, but I just want to just pause and just, allow the audience to sit with how emotionally and spiritually abusive this is, right? Like, you're talking about your entire adolescence feeling less than, feeling unworthy, feeling dirty, feeling this pressure, this consistent confessionals, being punished, and that punishment being, fairly public to your congregation. They can tell something's off, and we have quite a few documented cases, and I would say many undocumented cases of suicide to masturbatory shame. And I hope that what you're saying kind of impresses on the audience the toll this takes on a young, underdeveloped brain as they're developing both sexually and emotionally. What has been done to you is very abusive. And this is, of course, what we do to all the LDS youth. And then it also seems like just naturally you had a kind of an innocent personality, a personality type where you cared about being good and being a good guy, and so sometimes I think there are kids who leave the church a little bit less scathed because they kind of have this ability to roll their eyes at everybody and think everybody's kind of nutty, but but many of us are not like that when we're growing up. I wasn't like that either. I wanted to be the good girl. I wanted to be worthy and to do the right things. And anyway, I just want to pause because I think it's important to really acknowledge how damaging this is, this practice. And we're still doing it. This is not like, oh, we're talking about 50 years ago. This is what's happening. No, this is everything Preston is talking about is being done today, including the treatments now that we're going to talk about, and kind of the trajectory that you were sent on by the church and by even therapists and clinicians who are also members of the church and complicit with this type of abuse. And that's something we've been talking about a lot this summer, especially like, Jody Hildebrandt got a lot of press and attention due to being arrested to child abuse, not because of this practice, but because of something else. But she's lost her license, and she's kind of one kind of very public example of the types of treatment and protocols that a lot of these clinicians will actually kind of side with the church on, both in assessment and treatment, right? Because there is no porn addiction diagnosis. You can't diagnose somebody with a porn addiction or a sex addiction. You can diagnose people with obsessions and compulsions and impulsivity disorders, but it's amazing how many treatment centers and clinicians will just talk about sex addiction like it's a foregone conclusion, and how many people are in programs like you're going to talk about that just have zero results and effectiveness as far as the studies go. So that's where we're headed next. And anyway.
Yeah, I'm really, really glad that you paused and brought up just really how deep and ultimately lethal this can go, and often has and does. Because as a teenager, like, that's where my mind was going, but I didn't exactly know what was happening yet. And I'll talk about it more later. But all I could think about was, I cannot wait till I'm in heaven so that, oh my gosh, it's like I can't even like process how heavy that is. Of like, I just wanted to be in heaven. I just wanted to meet God. I couldn't wait for that day to come so that I wouldn't feel these things anymore, so that it could just be over. So anyway, yeah, leading up to when I started treatment. So I went on a mission and came home and, um, picked up right where we left off, of meeting with bishops and starting to feel out of control. And was, it was just hard because like I was navigating a lot. Like, it's hard to come home from a mission and get your feet underneath you and figure out what's next and try to feel normal again and find yourself. And at this time, when I came home from my mission, I actually joined the football team at Utah State University, and that was like a really exciting thing. But in the background, like, this issue was still going on. And so I would meet with bishops, and I heard very terrible things. Like, one bishop told me I needed to get this under control before it became an addiction because, quote, no girl will ever love me if I have this problem. And like you said earlier, he's the authority figure for God. So it's like, okay, he's right. Like, I got to get this under control. Like, I need to get married someday. The weight of the world was on my shoulders. And so here I was figuring this out, trying to navigate coming home, trying to process all that a mission is, which I know is a podcast for another day. But I ended up leaving the team because while I was having, like, it was a cool experience, it was a bucket list experience, I dreamed of that my whole life. Like, I was going through too much, and my mental health, like, was really bad. And so, yeah, it just affected this fabricated issue affected my entire life, to the point where I started, like you said, I started to feel extremely suicidal. And there were points, again, that I can remember so clearly, wanting seriously to end my life because of this problem. But thankfully, a protective factor I had at the time was, I was waiting for my now wife to get home off her mission. So I kept holding out, like, I gotta wait for her to just get home. I just gotta, like, anyway. So we started dating, and to kind of, I guess, make a long story short, we knew some people that were close to who had also, quote unquote, struggled. I personally have a hard time, like, talking about it right now, but just for the context of what we're talking about, they too had struggled with porn, and so they went to a addiction recovery treatment program called LifeStar. And so they referred us to LifeStar once we started dating, kind of in that same spirit of, like, let's nip this in the bud, let's fix this before it's ever an issue. And I guess just a little background, like, LifeStar, again, is a treatment program, and they have offices all throughout Utah, Idaho, and Arizona. And looking back, like, what is frustrating is, by the time I started LifeStar, I hadn't even viewed porn for about a year. Just, like, for whatever reason, I just didn't. But I still was sent there, and it was supported by my bishops and family members and my girlfriend at the time, of like, yeah, we got to do this because, masturbating, not okay. You used to look at porn, so let's make sure it never happens again. Yeah. And so it just, like, all of that happened in the past, we've talked up to this point, led me to then LifeStar. And I've really been thinking for a long time about talking about LifeStar, because it played such a significant role in my life in many different ways. I attended LifeStar from January of 2018 to, like, April of 2020. So for 2 years, me and my wife would drive from Logan, where we were living at the time, to Salt Lake, which is about a 2-hour drive depending on traffic. And she would go into her support group, and I would go into mine. And I really want to establish, again, like, I want to hold space for the fact that I did have very beautiful experiences there. my therapist there like really helped to set me on a trajectory of like tapping more into my emotions and just finding myself. And so there's a part of me that to this day, like it's taken me so long. It's taken me years to process and to even be able to talk about it today. But there's a part of me that still like really loves the people there. And also acknowledges that me and my wife and our relationship were deeply, deeply damaged. And so I guess just kind of a broad overview of what happens is they have kind of three phases that you go through, and essentially it's like working through like kind of your triggers, identifying what triggers you, what you can do when you're triggered. And then they even start to like, you have to kind of dissect every single fantasy you've ever had and identify maybe what underlying issue is causing you to have said fantasy, and just very, very intensive work. But, and I feel myself a little bit glazing over now because this is where it like was the most painful for me, is they kind of have this protocol that they do where if you're in a relationship, you need to work with your therapist to write a full disclosure, and they'll help you kind of like edit it, make it concise, but then you have to share it with your spouse. And essentially it's just like everything you've ever done, like, yeah. And then you share it with your spouse. And things that like I had to share were like places I've masturbated, things I've thought about, people I've thought about, like, and in the first day I went there, one of the first things they said was like, you need to be honest because secrecy fuels addiction. And so I thought, okay, let's do this. Like, again, I want to be good. I want to be a good person. So I'm going to be as honest as possible. And so I ended up sharing details with my wife that just never needed to be shared. It accomplished nothing. I look back at my experience and can confidently say I developed PTSD from my experience at LifeStar. Even to the point where like even to this day, sometimes I have nightmares about like confessing to my wife and her yelling at me or her leaving me or just feeling like a terrible person. And something that I was thinking about too was like, when I first went to LifeStar and started going to addiction recovery programs, at first it felt like just the most beautiful thing in the world. It felt like new age spirituality. It felt like a new way that I could begin talking or thinking about or conceptualizing Mormonism. But as time progressed, I just started to feel like these things aren't working for me. But it's like a microcosm of the church within these addiction recovery programs or within places like LifeStar, because the therapist ultimately is the authority figure. And so a lot of my time and energy was spent like bringing things to my therapist and saying, do I need to tell her this? Do I need to confess this detail? And him deciding like, yeah, you got to tell that, or nope, you don't need to. Like, and so something that started happening in the group I was in was we were all kind of given these soft like OCD diagnoses, like where we would start being told like, yep, you just want to like divulge this detail so bad because you have OCD, like, and let's talk to that OCD and figure out like why it needs to be shared. Okay. And then we get to a point where, nope, you don't need to share that. It'll just cause too much damage. And there were certain points throughout this whole thing where like some of the verbiage like felt freeing, like, oh, I have an addiction. This is why I can't stop. Oh, okay. It all makes sense now. Or, oh, I have OCD. Okay, this is why I have so much turmoil in my head. And I just lost my train of thought. But basically, like, Um, yeah, again, just so much fabricated turmoil and chaos. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
I'll give it back to you for a second.
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, take a deep breath. That's a lot. I'm trying to take deep breaths as you talk. So, I mean, what's interesting too, like let's consider this from the vantage point of your wife for a minute, right? So just like you mentioned that video where you see the man, going down the one route where he never looks at porn and his wife is happy and the children are happy. And, then you see the other video where the man is watching porn and the whole family system falls apart. So first of all, the church, like a lot of religious, entities do have very much gendered sexuality, right? Like men are the sexual deviants and women are the sexual purity ones who have to put up with the deviancy of men. And of course, there's no discussion of non-binary. There's no complication of gender, right? It's just men and women, and men act like this and women act like this. And
Yeah.
so these are messages too that we are getting, right, as we're growing up, right? And so we are taught explicitly that porn will ruin our marriages and our families. The porn that our husbands watch, right? And so that has two effects. First of all, for the young women or emerging adult women who are watching porn or who are masturbating, oftentimes this can lead them to think that they're even worse than most, because obviously only men should have this problem. If I'm a woman having this problem, that must make me triple the deviant, right? And so I've heard a lot of shame stories around females who have had these messages, or who also were referred to these addiction programs or whatever, when they're the only woman in the group, right? Or they're the only woman at the 12-step group or whatever. Yeah. Then the other much more common effect is that women are taught this fear response and are put right back into a role of gatekeeper, right? Like, it's my job as a woman to make sure my husband or my sons don't look at porn, and I need to monitor computers and I need to monitor phones. And then if my husband does come to me with any confession, or if I find out anything, then it's obviously an extremely scary experience, because she's been taught, kind of the same, like Jesse, like you've been taught fabricated problems. She's been taught fabricated problems. And so she usually has a very strong, very sincere, but very strong reaction to everything that's dear to her potentially falling apart. Mm-hmm. And so these programs that are complicit with this whole system basically help all of these fabrications stay very much alive. And like you're saying, at first, it can actually feel very helpful, helpful, because here's this fabricated problem. And now we have the fabricated solution for it. And in a space where both of you are feeling very lost, very confused, very helpless, very hopeless sometimes, to have that fabricated solution is like, oh, it's a moment of feeling like, oh, thank goodness, there's a program, there's something we can do about it. My husband isn't in denial. He's admitting that he's a porn addict, and the minute you challenge any of that system, then guess what? You are in denial. That's what they're telling you. See, this is what addicts do. You can't challenge the system. This is where it's also very much like church. You can't challenge the Mormon church and say, hey, I think you guys don't have this right. Well, we have decided this is what God has said. So it's right. There's no other option. Mm-hmm. And in a lot of ways, the addiction programs are very similar, because if you say, hey, I don't think I'm a porn addict, or this doesn't fit my situation, or I don't think some of these interventions are actually beneficial. I want to have some boundaries. No, now you're in denial. And now not only are your mentors and your therapists angry with you, but your wife is angry with you because you're not following the protocol. And you obviously don't want to get better, right? And a lot of times, of course, ecclesiastical leaders are in conjunction with these therapies and paying for the therapies and talking to the therapists. And so now they're pulling your temple recommends, and you're back to being unworthy and back to not being able to have a calling or pass the sacrament. And so you can see how it's just this big cyclical machine that nobody can challenge. And that therapists that I would think have had training as to not have their own religious biases be part of their therapy, boy, they're just really able to kind of ignore that. So the whole thing becomes a very unethical, abusive, harmful malpractice.
Yeah.
It's malpractice is what it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm really glad. So you brought up like there's no room oftentimes. Oh, okay. Rewind. There is never room in these spaces for polyamory, for queerness. Like there's no room.
There's no room for any type of sexual diversity at all. Even asexuality.
Asexuality, yes.
Yeah, nothing. There's just, it's heteronormative, it's married sex, and everybody has to show up in this one way, or you're considered sick sexually, really, because that's when you're starting to use words like addiction and treatment, and you're having to go travel 2 hours to get your treatment and your group support. We are now facing our sexuality from a disease model. Because we don't fit this religious standard that one religion has decided is the best way to be sexual.
Yeah, exactly. And something like you referred to the therapists who I don't know what occurs, like if the training isn't received, or maybe, when they receive their training, they're not in a place to be able to kind of process or think about maybe deconstructing some things about their own religious background. But something that I've heard many people talk about within the church is how sometimes, they get to a point where it's unsettling to have an answer for everything, why we're here, where we come from, where we're going, etc. The same thing existed in LifeStar of, oh, you're asexual, it's because of this attachment wound that you have, or you're homosexual, it's because of this attachment wound with your mother or father. And as soon as you can get over that, you'll be fixed. Like, you won't be gay anymore. Surprise, like, perfect. And then I even remember specifically hearing about how if anyone engages in polyamory or I can't remember what else. Yeah, any polyamory, like that relationship, like the core relationship, is destined to fall apart because you're toying with that attachment and you're not securely attached if you're interested in that. Just like it's just answers for everything that I tried to like apply to myself. Like, oh, okay, I got to do this work, and some of these drives will go away. So yeah, I wanted to touch on that. And also going back to just the wound that is like the female partner's wound in this, I just want to validate because, again, like just in the context of a heteronormative couple, like both sides are so screwed in this mess. Me and my wife have had countless terrible nights of, like you described, like me coming to her, confessing, and her just melting and falling apart and feeling like it's her fault and it's her job to fix and it's her job to give me more so that I'll stop being such an addict. So very just traumatic all around. And then like for me, it's like, oh, I see her like that. See, this is what my addiction is doing. It's destroying her. Okay, now I go further down the shame spiral. And now we're disconnected in our relationship. There was something me and my wife have talked a lot about recently is like in that experience, safety was not the priority. Connection was never the priority. I think I know they said, because it was told explicitly, like, our goal in LifeStar is to deconstruct the shame and to alleviate the guilt. In fact, real quick, I'll say, like, when I first went to LifeStar, my therapist guaranteed me that I would walk away from the program, like, never watching porn again. Well, surprise, that guarantee, like, can I get my money back? Like, that guarantee was not fulfilled. I should call customer service. But yeah, just going back to yeah, what I was saying about my wife is like, oh yeah, that we just feel like there was never any like safety established. Like because it was just so heightened of like, I'm the problem, I got to figure this out, and until I figure it out, she will never be safe. And something with the self-disclosure protocol is it was commonplace for people, and therapists would recommend it, for the spouse, the female, to book a hotel for the night that they did the full disclosure in case it was like too much to hear. So it was just like sometimes I just feel like
Right.
it was some of,
Right. It's
yeah, we're
separated.
separated.
Yeah. There's this, I mean, you know, in church, we hear a lot of times philosophies of men mingled with scripture, like that's a put down. I'm like, this is philosophies of religion mingled with evidence-based care, right? I mean, there's just no, like when you say, well, there were parts of it that were helpful. Well, sure. You know, I mean, getting together in groups is helpful.
Yeah.
Having somebody listen to your story is helpful. There's attachment that happens with these people, but it's just kind of like if I go to cancer treatment and I'm like, well, it was really helpful for the nurse to smile at me and for me to feel like somebody cared about the fact that I was, you know, that I had cancer, and they gave me some information about my body. And then but nobody ever gave me the chemotherapy. Nobody ever really gave me the treatment I needed to actually get better. Who cares if it was helpful, right? This is what drives me nuts when I hear people say, well, parts of it were helpful. I'm like, go to treatment that is all helpful, not little bits and pieces of it, right? Or people who are offering kind of like mixed bag treatment. The other thing that drives me crazy is to hear all this attachment pathology, right? Like attachment theory is actually a wonderful theory. It has a lot of valid applications, but it is used incessantly incorrectly when we're talking about sexuality in ways that people don't understand human sexuality. And I feel like a lot of these folks have their own attachment issues to their religion and to their belief structures, and, you know, getting to the point where you're promising things that you can't even promise. You know, I mean, that's just telling people that they're not going to be gay when we have, unfortunately, decades of research showing everything people have tried to not make, you know, to not have gay people around, right? And so it's just so, and then even just basic boundaries, like this whole full disclosure thing, like that, maybe people think that's good. Like, you know, couples should be completely honest with each other. When you start really getting to the nitty gritty, all of us have fantasies or thoughts or people we're attracted to that we don't share. Like there's an aspect of privacy, basic decency that is each of ours personal right. And actually, we also know that if you start sharing so much and every single thought, that actually interferes with eroticism, interferes with some of that mystery and some of that, you know, so there's a difference between honesty and privacy. And I feel like these programs have zero ability to distinguish between the two, right? That yes, there's secrecy, which usually is not great, especially in a primary relationship, but everybody has a right to privacy. Whether you're married or not. And so these things just get completely wound in a way that is so unhelpful. And every time I hear it, I just have my own reaction to it, right? Because I'm like, all these people are being harmed, and people like you and your wife, like good people, lovely people, people who want good sex, who want a good relationship, who love each other, are oftentimes being put into programs that, like you're saying, actually detach them. I can't tell you how many people I know of and who have told me that they've divorced or separated due to these programs.
Yeah, it's so sad. Like we talk about how just with everything I was going through at the time, I never needed sex addiction treatment. I just needed a loving, ethical therapist to help me process other things that were really going on. Because I think I said this earlier, like, I feel like a lot of like a self-fulfilling prophecy occurs in these treatments, at least for me. I'll speak for myself. But like I said earlier, at the time when I started, like, I hadn't watched porn in a long time. Like, again, as if that matters. But as soon as I started watching porn again. Like, I wonder why. Like, because suddenly, like, it's on the forefront of my mind, and the anxiety around this issue is at the forefront of my brain again. And so yeah, and as like you were saying, like there's no room to question things. started to get to the point where I did, like I started to wonder, like, man, these guys will stay in business so long as men in the church keep watching porn. Like that's their business model. And that started to like sit uneasy with me. So a couple times they even brought it up. Like I remember one time I was like, so why is porn bad? Like what, like, can you just tell me, like, why is it bad? And because something just wasn't like, the dots weren't connecting all the way. Um, because, and I want to again acknowledge, like, there is unethical porn, there is very harmful practices in the industry, but ultimately it's up to the individual to decide what's healthy for you. What are you comfortable with? Like, what do you feel good about? It's up to you. But my therapist told me, oh, it harms your spirit. It causes betrayal for your spouse, and that was like all he could really say. So it's just like I started to kind of question things, and as time went on, I started going to like 12-step groups outside of this. So I was going to both, and went through that for a long time. And there was a period of time where I was still seeing my LifeStar therapist and stopped going to 12-step groups, and told him. And then at a certain point, I went back to 12-step groups because it kind of feels like I was like that ball in that game where it's bouncing from side to side and you're like keeping it in. Like I was challenging the framework a little bit, like kind of dosing myself. And when I came back to a 12-step group and told my therapist, he told me how glad he was that I made that decision and how I was making the right thing. And so, yeah, again, just like a lot of biases, like on the part of, those who I was in their care, like just kind of kept perpetuating a lot of the harm. And so, yeah, so for me, like as I went through these things, kept finding like I still am doing these things. I'm still having these urges. No matter how hard I'm working, I'm having the urges. But luckily, like I have to really acknowledge like the strength of me and my wife. Like in all of this, we started reclaiming our own autonomy and power back little by little. So at one point, she stopped going to church, and I stopped telling my bishop. So my new thing was, I'm not telling my bishop a damn thing anymore because I can't handle this. And at the time, that caused a lot of anxiety, but I'm so glad I did. And then ultimately, we both stopped going to church. And kind of the cliche, you lose a lot of community. Well, in the 12-step community, when I was actively in it, I got close to a lot of different individuals. But when I decided that, like, I'm not an addict, these programs are not for me, and I chose to leave, it was like leaving the church all over again because people stopped calling, people stopped picking up my phone calls. And so it was a very isolating experience, like to go through all that garbage, all that trauma, and then try to reclaim some safety back, because then I lost a lot by doing that. So yeah, I feel like that's the bulk of my story, but kind of ultimately what led me to here now, as I mentioned, I heard you on your podcast with the Mormon stories and how you were excommunicated for trying to save people like me from wanting to commit suicide for masturbating. Because that's what I wanted to share too, is when I was in LifeStar, my suicidal ideation has never been worse. Just the shame of seeing like how I felt like I was affecting my wife, and the shame of not being able to stop. But then I heard you on your podcast, and my wife, like, it just clicked with me and my wife, and she really wanted me to stop going to 12-step meetings for probably a good year until I stopped. Like, so shout out to her for seeing through the bullshit before I ever did fully. So I just want to say that too. I'm so grateful, like, for her perspective, because I feel like she offered so much like resistance to the system that I wasn't always ready to see. And because of her consistent like resilience, like I feel so much safer because I found your podcast. I joined your male sexual shame group, and I guess excuse me, something that like you always said in there is like fuck the shame away. So like what has been my experience that felt so counterintuitive when I first started hearing like reliable information and it's new information felt so counterintuitive, but here I am now, like my sexual media use feels so much less compulsive. I have safety. My nervous system is relaxing when it comes to sexuality. I'm learning that I can have boundaries. Like me and my wife are like feeling safe with each other again. Like, so again, just such a fabricated storm. And it's just so sad because I feel like all the people in the programs, like the LifeStar guys over there, like they're well-meaning. They feel so strongly that they're like fighting against, like that they're fulfilling a very important like purpose. And I've also heard you say a lot like systems, not people. So it's like, it's just a really sad system.
Yeah.
And I'm just really happy that I've managed to like find a way out.
Yeah.
It's been so hard. Like even still, I haven't attended those meetings in maybe 2 years, but I still have those like triggers come up that I'm bad, that I did something wrong, like always ruminating. And so those triggers still come up, but I'm at least like on a path to heal. So anyway.
Yeah, that's a lovely wrap up of your story. And I'm so glad that you and your wife were able to, influence each other and figure out that this wasn't a model that was really going to help you find your erotic potential, your romantic potential, your sexual potential, as a couple and even individually. I think that's another thing that we've missed a lot in these cultures, is that we're only given a lens of sexuality that's very relational, right? So I think you mentioned earlier, you thought, oh, well, if I come home from my mission and when my wife comes home, or, my future wife comes home, then we'll get married and masturbation and porn won't be an issue anymore because I'll have somebody to have sex with. But we're never taught that we're individuals sexually first, right? We belong to ourselves and we have a relationship with ourselves sexually. And then we develop to the point that if we want, we can have a sexual relationship with another person, but there's no respect for that in the system we come from. It's only about marriage, and it's only about having sex with another person. And so these themes of entitlement, right? Like you're saying, I'm pressuring her, or she feels pressured to give me sex so that I won't stray. I mean, oh my goodness, so many sad stories of folks who really love each other, but in a lot of ways are taught to be in battle with each other or with themselves around their sexuality. So, and I agree with you. It is very systemic, although in some ways, I do hold my colleagues to, ethical norms and evidence-based practice, which I don't think they're adhering to.
Yeah, there are ethical codes like we more or less swear to abide by.
And they're not abiding by them. When you are complicit with a church system and offering mental and sexual health protocols, you are not abiding by the ethics that guide your license and that guide your profession. And so this problem is just rampant. It's everywhere. It's here in Utah. It's in the Bible Belt. That's where I lived for many years, and I could see all the Christian counselors doing the same thing. It's a rampant problem, and probably the reason why I have a little less empathy for it. Maybe empathy is not the right word. I probably do have empathy for it, but I feel like I had to do this work. And it was challenging work to challenge my own biases, to challenge my own ideas, to allow myself to be challenged by other professionals who knew more about sexuality than I did, and who were trained more than I did. So I feel like when you're willing to do the work, you're expecting others in your profession to do the work with you, right? And not continue these very harmful practices. So I'm super glad that you are where you're at. Super glad that you attended my male sexual shame group. Just for those who want to know, if you have any story that's similar to Preston, that's what this group is about. My next group starts January 30th at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. It's a 7-week online group. And I think you would agree, Preston, that it's a beautiful thing to see these men come together and talk about these kinds of experiences with both honesty and rawness and vulnerability, but also humor and, camaraderie. It's a very powerful thing for me to witness. And I'm always very impressed with the men who show up and are willing to do that work with me.
Yeah, I attended the group a year ago and I still keep almost daily contact with those guys. And I guess like the last thing I just wanted to say is like, anyone out there, like, who has been told you're an addict, you feel like you're an addict, please hear me. You are not an addict. You are a human being experiencing biological processes. And something that you said in the male sexual shame group that has become my mantra is whenever you feel like your sexual media use is maybe out of control or you don't feel good about the frequency of it, you said to first, like, just with non-judgmental kindness and awareness, investigate what's going on in your life. What's going on that's causing you stress, that is making you want to like cope, that makes you feel the need to like relax or check out with porn. Like, we don't have to make porn the focus. We can make you the focus of what is stressing you out, what's going on in your family, your work life, your health. Like, it's so much beyond Pornhub.com or what, you know what I mean? Like, it just drives me insane. Like, let's look at the person. Porn is not as big as it's blown up to be. Like, I just want to understand why you're struggling. Porn just happens to be your coping mechanism because you're sad.
Right.
It's not that much. It's not that serious. Just so angry.
Right. Yeah, my position is sexual media is like many things we consume. It can be very helpful in a lot of ways, like food or clothing or everything we consume. And like anything else, we can get out of balance with it.
Mm-hmm.
That's true. Yeah. Anything that we as humans do, we can use in healthy ways, we can use in unhealthy ways. And so that's where that coping thing comes in. And even then, it's okay to use it as one of your coping tools. But, I'm hoping that everybody has a diversity of coping tools, right? And so that we're not dependent necessarily on only one way to cope, whether it's eating or spending money or overworking, all the things that we do in life. So I appreciate you saying that. I'm glad that was helpful for you. Well, my hope from this interview, one, is that we've normalized. I love it when people share personal stories because I think there are a lot of people who will relate to much of what you and your wife experienced. I also just want to let people get to know you, Preston Hobbs, who's kind of, a new person in our practice. And sometimes when people can put a face and a voice and, it can be easier to reach out and set up an appointment when they feel like, well, I was already comfortable listening to him through this thing. So I just want people to know that, yes, Preston has openings currently at Symmetry Counseling. He takes some insurances, so make sure you call the office if you want to meet with him, and we can see how we can set you up with that. And then, like I said, my next male sexual shame group is starting January 30th. I still have some spots available for that. And
thank you, Natasha. No, I don't think so. That was very cathartic. I just want people to be happy.
Right. Yeah. So maybe we'll end with "Fuck the Shame Away," which is really it's a funny song from this show called Sexual Education. But the reason why I think it's so actually clinically useful is that when we start, it's interesting that you said too, that you couldn't heal without facing some anxiety. So sometimes in order to heal and to get shame out of our system, we actually have to step into these spaces that are uncomfortable. And that's actually how we get the shame and guilt to go away. So it's actually clinically based. All right. Well, have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much for your time, and we will see you soon.
Hey, sounds good. Have a good day yourself, Natasha.
Thank you for listening to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes are by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. Now tishki say the so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. 10,000 years of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. Now tishki say the so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. To the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. Now tishki say the so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. To the homeland of the heart. To the homeland